could only occur, of course, with light reaching the surface of the earth and with plenty of carbon dioxide on the earth, which scientists again know was a very major component of the earth's early atmosphere. Plants, of course, have to breathe carbon dioxide in order to survive. By the way, I want to point out that if you read through the Bible and you say, there's a step missing. We don't have the dinosaurs mentioned in Genesis, or we don't have this, or we don't have that. Keep in mind, God's purpose in telling us the story of creation isn't to give us a science textbook. You could write a whole book on any one of these areas. But his purpose was to show that creation was purposeful, that he did it, and to describe the steps in how they would relate to man. So most of the animals and vegetation and things that you find listed in Genesis are animals, vegetation, things that are important to man for one reason or another. Let's move on to step 6. Step 6 you can find in Genesis 1:14. And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark the seasons and the days and the years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the sky to give light on earth. And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the expanse of the sky to give light on earth to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. Think about it for a second from a scientific point of view. We've talked about how we have basically we have light coming through this translucent atmosphere. We have plants now that are taking in carbon dioxide. What do they produce? They produce oxygen. Oxygen, of course, is a vital element necessary for any of the creatures that are going to be breathing oxygen, like man. Interestingly, oxygen also is one of the factors of helping create a transparent atmosphere like we have today. So that suddenly we're able to see through the atmosphere, and we're able to see the stars in the heavens and the great lights of the sun and the moon, which previously in a translucent atmosphere would be barely visible, and of course the star is probably not visible at all. So essentially this step 6, agrees with what science would agree happened once you consider God's Spirit hovering over the surface of the deep. Modern translations seem to imply that the sun and the moon and the stars were created that day. However, this is where you need to go back to the original Hebrew in the Bible, because as we said earlier in this series, sometimes Hebrew words had to be used because there weren't other words that could be used, and sometimes there is a misunderstanding in modern translation. If you examine the original Hebrew in the Bible, you'll find that it does not use the word bara. Bara in Hebrew means to create out of nothing. Now in Genesis 1:1, the creation of the heavens and the earth, bara is used. And bara is used in the creation of man and other events of creation. However, on day 4, the word bara is not used. On day 4, the original Hebrew words could have meant made, as in the past tense, or could have meant made to appear. Obviously, if in God's process oxygen was making the atmosphere more transparent, then the sun, moon, and stars would have been made to appear on the surface of the earth, which is where God's Spirit was hovering. And of course, this was what allowed the value that's discussed in this chapter to man. The value here is to mark the seasons and day and night and that sort of thing. So it's important to understand that even though we have modern translations that might be a little bit misleading, that to really understand exactly what the Bible is telling us, we need to be open to the original Hebrew words that were used. Step 7 is in Genesis 1:20. Let me just read it briefly. And God said, let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to his kind. And God saw that it was good. What we're talking about here is, again, whether it's a 24-hour day or a long period of time, as scientists would believe and old Earth would believe, there's the creation of small sea animals and the birds, and not necessarily in that order. It's just basically in that period of time. That's when these are created. Now, all of the animals discussed in the Bible are those that were important to man. Let's move on to step 8, Genesis 1:24. Let me briefly read that. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. It also is interesting to me that the Bible is very clear that these animals and creatures are creating according to their kind. What that says is, it's not saying they evolved from one to another. They basically were created in a class in and of themselves, which of course now with DNA research, we know basically what these kinds or how we can define these kinds through DNA and through their ability to reproduce. Let's move to step 9. Step 9 is in Genesis 1:26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let him rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." Verse 27 says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him." So here we have the Bible finally talking about the creation of man. Again, I want to emphasize the word bara is used here, created out of nothing. In other words, there was no pre-existing ape that he turned into a man. He created man out of nothing. An important point to realize is that man is defined in the Bible as having a spiritual relationship with God. Only man was created to worship God, which you find in many places within the Bible. Step 10, that actually occurs in Genesis 2:2. Let me read that briefly. "By the seventh day, God had finished the work he'd been doing, and so on the seventh day he rested from all his work." At the time of Moses, there was no culture on earth that had any idea of how planets developed or the world or creatures on the earth. No one had this information that we know today. But somehow, Moses happened to know these steps. That's a miracle in and of itself, that even someone would know the steps, which would imply that it was divinely inspired. But for 1 minute, let's assume that all of today's science existed back then, except that Moses just had to guess the order of the 10 events of creation. In other words, let's say that science knew all this stuff, and Moses was given the challenge, "Okay, Moses, guess from 1 to 10 how creation happened." Well, just for Moses to properly guess the correct order of the 10 events described, assuming he knew them, would be equivalent to winning a state lottery. And of course that assumes that he knew the events to begin with. If we randomly evolved from other life forms, in a sense, we are really no different than animals. It would imply that there is no God that purposely created us. And if we have no God and no purpose, it leads to the idea of no absolute authority. How do we define right and wrong? How do we define good and bad? Have you ever heard the phrase, "I have to do what's right for me," or a phrase, "If it feels good, do it"? But what was right for Hitler was not right for the world. Many things that, quote, feel good can lead